প্রকাশিত হওয়া, এই সব কিছুর সঙ্গে আমাদের অনিল বিশ্বাসের একটা অত্যন্ত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ অবদান রয়েছে। এছাড়াও তিনি ভারতের কমিউনিস্ট পার্টি মার্ক্সবাদী রাজ্য কমিটির সম্পাদক ছিলেন, পার্টির অনেকগুলো সদস্য ছিলেন, আমাদের পত্রিকার একজন নিয়মিত লেখক ছিলেন এবং তার লেখা অনেক বই, তার লেখা অনেক প্রবন্ধ প্রকাশিত হয়েছে, সেটা রাজনৈতিক বিষয়, সামাজিক বিষয়, নানান বিষয়। এছাড়া পার্টির কর্মসূচি সময়োপযোগী করার জন্য যে প্রোগ্রাম কমিশন হয়েছিল, সেই প্রোগ্রাম কমিশনের তিনি সদস্য ছিলেন। আমাদের পার্টির ইতিহাস লেখার জন্য যে হিস্ট্রি কমিশন হয়েছিল, ইতিহাস কমিশন, তারও তিনি সদস্য ছিলেন। এরকম বহু বিষয়ে তার অবদান এবং পশ্চিমবাংলার রাজনীতিতে, পশ্চিমবাংলার কমিউনিস্ট আন্দোলন গড়ে তোলার ক্ষেত্রে তার ভূমিকা আমরা সবসময় স্মরণ করি। বিশেষ করে তার আকস্মিক মৃত্যু 2006 সালে আমাদের সকলকেই আঘাত দিয়েছে এবং আমরা চাই তার স্মৃতিকে জাগ্রত রাখতে, এবং সেজন্যই আমরা এই স্মারক বক্তৃতার প্রতি বছর আয়োজন করব। আজকের এই স্মারক বক্তৃতায় যিনি বক্তব্য রাখবেন আপনাদের সামনে, শশী কুমার, তিনি তার পরিচয় আপনাদের হয়তো অনেকেরই জানা, তা সত্ত্বেও আমাকে কয়েকটি কথা বলতে হচ্ছে। সেটা হচ্ছে যে তার সংবাদ মাধ্যম জগতে তিনি শুধুমাত্র কোনো একটা দিকে ছিলেন না বা একটা দিকে নেই। তিনি প্রথমে প্রিন্ট মিডিয়া অর্থাৎ মুদ্রণ মাধ্যম, সংবাদপত্র, পত্রপত্রিকা, তার সাংবাদিকতার সমস্ত কিছুর মধ্যে ছিলেন। এছাড়া হচ্ছে ইলেকট্রনিক মাধ্যম, তার মধ্যে ছিলেন। প্রথম ভারতীয় বেসরকারি স্যাটেলাইট চ্যানেল এশিয়া নেট, যেটা কেরালা থেকে চালু হয়েছিল অনেক বছর আগে, তার প্রতিষ্ঠাতা ছিলেন শশী কুমার। পরবর্তীকালে তিনি চেন্নাইতে মিডিয়া ফাউন্ডেশন তৈরি করেন এবং সেই মিডিয়া ফাউন্ডেশন এশিয়ান কলেজ অফ জার্নালিজম তৈরি হয় এবং এশিয়ান কলেজ অফ জার্নালিজম প্রতিষ্ঠাতা, এবং এখনো পর্যন্ত সেই এশিয়ান কলেজ অফ জার্নালিজম শুধু ভারতবর্ষে নয়, গোটা পৃথিবীতে একটা গণমাধ্যমের বড় প্রতিষ্ঠান হিসেবে কাজ করে চলেছে। এছাড়া ব্যক্তিগতভাবে তিনি সাউথ এশিয়ার করেসপন্ডেন্ট হিসেবে হিন্দু এবং ফ্রন্টলাইন পত্রিকায় কাজ করেছেন। বিভিন্ন সময় অর্থাৎ পূর্ব ইউরোপের যখন সমাজতন্ত্রের বিপর্যয়, সোভিয়েতের সমাজতন্ত্রের বিপর্যয়, এই সমস্ত সময়তে তার যে সমস্ত রিপোর্ট আমরা পড়েছি, এবং এখনো পর্যন্ত নিয়মিতভাবে তিনি ফ্রন্টলাইন পত্রিকায় লিখে চলেন। খুব সাম্প্রতিক সময়তে তিনি একটি পোর্টাল, এখন যেটা ডিজিটাল প্ল্যাটফর্ম আমরা বলি, অর্থাৎ যে সোশ্যাল মিডিয়া যে ফর্ম, ওয়েব পোর্টাল, সে ওয়েব পোর্টাল 4টি ভাষায়, হিন্দি, ইংরেজি, মালয়ালি এবং তামিল, তো এই 4টে ভাষাতে নিউজ পোর্টাল এশিয়া ভিল তিনি লঞ্চ করতে চলেছেন কিছুদিনের মধ্যেই। হয়তো অন্যান্য ভাষাও কিছুদিনের মধ্যেই তিনি এই পোর্টাল আসবে বলে আমরা আশা করছি। ফলে সংবাদ মাধ্যমের জগতে তিনি অনেক দিন ধরেই আমাদের সঙ্গে রয়েছেন, বিভিন্নভাবে আমাদের পরামর্শ দিয়েছেন, আমাদের সঙ্গে মনোভাব নিয়ে চলেছেন। তার লেখার মধ্যে দিয়ে আমরা সেটা প্রকাশ পেয়েছি এবং সেই কারণেই আমরা আজকের এই স্মারক বক্তৃতায় তাকে আমন্ত্রণ জানিয়েছিলাম এবং তিনি সেই আমন্ত্রণ গ্রহণ করেছেন। জনশক্তির পক্ষ থেকে তাকে আমাকে কৃতজ্ঞতা, ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি। আমি শশী কুমারকে এখন তার বক্তব্য রাখার জন্য অনুরোধ করছি। আই রিকোয়েস্ট শশী কুমার টু deliver his speech in the memorial lecture of Comrade Anil বিশ্বাস.
Thank you, Comrade Ovik. Comrades, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a distinct and unique pleasure and privilege to be asked to deliver the first commemorative lecture in memory of the late Comrade Anil Vishwas. I have not interacted too much with him personally, but of course we have all heard of him, admired him at a distance, as a second generation luminary of the CPIM, as the editor of Ganashakti, who blazed a distinct trail for that paper, as a party secretary in West Bengal, as a member of the Politburo of the party, someone who hailed from very humble origins in Nadia, became an activist student in his college in youth, in his student days, spent nearly a year in prison, and then joined the party. He was a great organizer. He had a reputation of being a great organizer, liked by everybody, and played a seminal role, as we said, in Ganashakti and also in the compilation of the history of the party. It's also a great and memorable occasion for me whenever one comes to this historic city, because for a media practitioner, Kolkata has a special significance. It is the crucible of journalism in India. It is here that journalism really began in the subcontinent. Over 200 years of British rule, the East India Company. We remember a whimsical, perhaps a cantankerous, but a very pioneering figure, James Hickey, whose Bengal Gazette started here in Calcutta in 1780. Hickey got into trouble very soon with the powers that be, with the Governor General Warren Hastings, with the then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Kolkata, Elijah MP, and others. But what was significant is that he stood for bold journalism, perhaps a shade cantankerous, but bold journalism. And he paid the price. He had to spend long years in prison. He died a pauper, literally. And I think it is doffing a hat or acknowledging that Bengal Gazette, that later on we had the Bengal Gazette of Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya, much later, perhaps in 1816 and so on. And therefore the saga of journalism in India begins here, really speaking, in Kolkata, where the first newspaper was published, was rolled off the press. And today, as we have perhaps more than 100,000 newspapers, registered newspapers in this country, over nearly 500 million people watching television and so on, it's important to remember where this whole craft and art and vocation and calling of journalism began. I think it's significant and important on this occasion when we remember Comrade Anil Biswas to look at where journalism belongs in the scheme, in the overarching scheme of the ideology of Marxism itself. This is significant because in the common mind, in the popular mind, there's this misconception that socialism or communism are antithetical to the freedom of the press. Misconception because at its roots, no one could have been a greater exemplar of freedom of speech and expression. No one could have been a greater journalist than Karl Marx himself. Indeed, it has been said that if he did not go on to write Das Kapital and be known as setting the foundations of an entire new paradigm of understanding the world in terms of economic determinism, he would have been known as the greatest journalist of his century. Karl Marx's story as a journalist is one that has unfortunately not found the importance it deserves in the discourse even of the left, or shall I say, particularly of the left. And that has been a huge travesty in terms of recording the relationship of the ideology of Marxism and journalism. Karl Marx, as we know, was a professor of philosophy, but didn't practice philosophy as a vocation, partly because of the inimical attitude to the authorities of the time to independent-minded philosophers in academic situations. His own mentor, Bruno Boyer, got into trouble because of his dalliances with philosophy and what he was trying to teach, the essence of Christianity of the Feuerbach tradition. And Karl Marx early on recognized that being a professor of philosophy in the formal sense in an academic situation in a university would be a very short-lived proposition. He chose instead the path of letters that journalism presented. We know that he was a fierce critic of the Prussian state. He worked in the Rheinische Zeitung, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which were newspapers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the Prussian state. He was the editor of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in the 1842, if I remember right. And he wrote eloquently against the excesses of the state, against the absolutism of Russian rulers, against the whimsical, arbitrary ways in which they governed. So much so that he had to flee the empire and move to Paris. From there again, he had to flee, and eventually, as we know, he settled down in London. In London again, his journalistic pursuit was what earned him his money, apart from, of course, the liberal or the timely grants, the periodic grants that his colleague and comrade Friedrich Engels provided him, the financial succor that he provided him. The only earning of Karl Marx in his life was as a journalist. And he was a highly valued journalist. He was a chief European correspondent of the New York Tribune. New York Tribune had a daily edition, it had weekly editions, it also had more than one edition in some weeks, in many weeks. And Karl Marx on an average wrote twice a week, long pieces, long, analytical, serious, intensive pieces for the New York Tribune. It's important to remember that he was paid £5 per column that he wrote, which was the highest paid among any columnist at that time in Europe. These are facts that we don't know unless we look for them. So he was the journalist par excellence of his times. He literally blazed a new trail in terms of journalism. He spoke and wrote eloquently against injustices everywhere. His ken was vast. His sweep, his canvas was very wide. His mental horizons were constantly expanding. He'd write about what was happening in Spain, in Austria, in England, in the United States, in Asia, in India, in Turkey, with magisterial authority and assurance. And these were read in the corridors of power. He wrote a blistering series of articles. He would write a series sometimes on an issue or against a person who he thought deserved to be destroyed. Palmerston was at the receiving end of his ire. He wrote a series of several articles against Lord Palmerston, much to the delight, of course, of Palmerston's enemies, the great politician in England. And this was the caliber of Karl Marx, the journalist. he spoke repeatedly, very, very passionately about the freedom of the press. He said that, and I quote, "The free press remains good, even when its products are bad, because these products are a deviation from the nature of the free press. As against this, a censored press," he says, "remains bad, even when its products may be good." So he believed intrinsically in the value, the goodness, in the importance of the free press. He railed against censorship. At one point he says, censorship can never be good. Censorship can never be legal, even when it is a law. Censorship can never be legal, even when it is a law, just as slavery can never be legal, even when it is a law. Because slavery was a law in this time. He said slavery may be the law, but it is not legal in the ethical, spiritual sense. Similarly, he said, censorship can never be legal. I have not come across anyone who has spoken quite so passionately, consistently, and eloquently for the freedom of the press. Because he argues that censorship is a bane, is dangerous even for governments, because, to quote him, in such situations, quote, "The government hears only its own voice, knows that it hears only its own voice, and is yet fixed on the delusion to hear the voice of the people, and demands from the people to fall for the trick." Unquote. In other words, he's saying, if there is no free press, the government of the day may not indeed know what is happening. And this is exactly a version of what Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, told us recently, far more recently. The famine, the huge famine in China goes unnoticed, at least formally unnoticed, because there is no free press. The press does not report the famine. The party organization down to the grassroots level does not report the famine, because if you report the famine, you're seen as a defaulter. And therefore an entire famine happens. Millions of people die, and the ruling apparatus of the party in China either turns a blind eye to it, or sweeps it under the carpet, or pretends it is not happening. It was the elephant in the room, it was the elephant in the nation, and they pretended the elephant isn't there. All because, as Sen eloquently argues, because of the absence of a free press. And therefore he comes to this idea of the free press as an early alarm kind of, the role of the free press in ringing an early alarm in situations of national crisis. This is Marx reflecting more or less the same view centuries earlier. And then again, why does he goes into it in such detail, in such nuanced detail, which is why it's so significant to try and recapitulate some of these ideas. He says at another point, again, in relation to the freedom of the press, quote, "Since people must consider uncensored publications as lawless, they will get used to considering lawlessness as free, freedom as lawlessness, lawfulness as unfreedom." This needs some thinking through, but look at how he's imagining the situation, how he's deconstructing the problem. Since people must consider uncensored publications as lawless, uncensored publications, if you go by a normative concept of censorship, there are many people who argue today that we need regulation, external regulation for the free press, because the press is exceeding its limits. The press is becoming irresponsible, which is true. I'm not all for it. We will discuss the pros and cons of that. But he says, if you consider a normative situation where censorship is to be the norm, people will consider uncensored publications as lawless. Then they will get used to considering lawlessness as free, and freedom as lawlessness, lawfulness as unfreedom. Thus, he says, censorship kills the public spirit. Karl Marx believed in the total freedom of the press. He did not believe in censorship of any kind, preemptive censorship, censorship by an external authority or force. But he characterizes the need for such a press, a free press, as what he characterizes as the folk press, the people's press, the folk press, the people's press, as against what Engels and he commonly referred to as the bourgeois press. Because bourgeois press was interested in the financial bottom line. It was a market function. It belonged to a market paradigm. It was a commercial enterprise. Whereas he said, in the folk press, the public interest ruled supreme. Public interest. And that's the operative word. The freedom of the press is important, but the freedom of the press, which is wedded, which is devoted, which is dedicated, which pursues the public interest. The free press, in this sense, is the ever-present, to quote again, vigilant eye of the people's spirit, the embodiment of the people's trust in itself. It is the spiritual mirror of the people and the public spirit, which may be delivered to every cottage cheaper than coal gas. So he believed in wide distribution of the press, and he concludes by saying, he's almost going to the top here. He says, the press, the free press, should be multifarious, ubiquitous, and omniscient. So this is the kind of intrinsic faith that Karl Marx had and spoke about in terms of the freedom of the press. He recognized, even in his time, that the United States had the natural phenomenon of a free press. Because we know that in the United States, the free press was part of the struggle for independence, part of the struggle for the American War of Independence. It was there in the Bill of Rights, it was there in the entire process of constitution making, which is why in the US Constitution, the very first amendment to the US Constitution says, Congress shall make no laws which abridge the freedom of the press, period. Which is why in the United States, you have the kind of freedom of the press that is perhaps the envy of much of the rest of the world. Despite all the distortions of capitalism, despite the distortions of the current presidential system in the United States, you find that the free press is too free in that sense. It's not possible to contain or restrict the freedom of the press in the United States because it is prescribed, constitutionally prescribed. It's outlined in the Constitution, in the very first amendment of the US Constitution. So as against, for instance, in the Indian context, where we do not have such a prescriptive right of freedom of the press in our Constitution. The freedom of the press in the Indian Constitution is a derived right, is an inferred right, inferred from the freedom of speech and expression, which is the right of every Indian citizen under the Indian Constitution. And therefore, as a media practitioner or as a media entrepreneur, I can exercise the right of freedom of expression and start a newspaper, start a television channel, start a portal. There is no specific freedom of expression enshrined in the Constitution. We infer the freedom of expression of the press from this freedom of expression, which is enshrined in Article 19(1)(a) and (g) of the Indian Constitution under the Fundamental Rights chapter, which speaks of freedom of speech and expression, freedom of movement, freedom to practice any profession, with reasonable restrictions. Of late, in fact, this caveat of reasonable restrictions has been prioritized all out of context by those who are for an external regulation for the press, including by illustrious thinkers like the former chairman of the Press Council, Justice Kajju, who has gone on record to say we need an external regulation because Article 19 allows for reasonable restrictions, and therefore we need to have a structure, a mechanism in place to impose those reasonable restrictions. That is what I mean by external regulation for the press. That is putting the cart before the horse. That is like making a supplement, qualifying kind of clause supervene the main clause. Reasonable restrictions are to a clause. You cannot make reasonable restrictions more important than the clause itself. So the point is that there's a distinction. So Karl Marx recognized that you need that kind of a constitutional environment for the press to flourish. And I dare argue been a happier man if he had lived, in the 1920s, if he had, when the Soviet Union, the role of the press was intact for historical reasons, for contextual reasons, for reasons of war communism, for reasons of having to face a particular situation there. But then that became the norm. And the role of the press, or the role of the media, as seen and as described by Lenin, by the second generation leadership, and thereafter since the 1920s, shall we say, was very different and almost contradictory, I would argue, with the vision of the free press that Karl Marx enumerated so eloquently and so exhaustively and so intensely. Karl Marx also goes on to say why public interest is central to the freedom of the press. Because if it is commercial interest, then there is no argument for freedom of the press. Today, we are facing that problem. We have a press in India, indeed like in the United States too, but then there is freedom guaranteed in the Constitution, where the press is part of the market paradigm. So much a part of the market paradigm that the public interest role of the press has receded, is put on the back burner, is marginalized. Karl Marx in fact then argues, and I quote him again, first freedom of the press, he says, the first freedom of the press is not to be a business. The press has the freedom not to be a business, and that is the first freedom of the press. Whereas today we will argue, our newspaper owners and barons, those running our television stations or the big media in this country, both India and those who are colluding with foreign players who are coming in, argue that it's a laissez-faire function. It's a function of free market in which the press can survive. And the press demands that as a matter of right. Public demand. It's a free market, field is demanded. It's also part of the American legacy, because the American legacy is a marketplace of ideas. Just as Oliver Wendell Holmes spoke famously about marketplace of ideas. It's a contradiction in terms. Marketplace of ideas. What he meant is that if you are meaning that ideas should jostle, there should be collision of ideas and therefore a betterment of human personality or of civilization, you don't call it marketplace. So the marketplace of ideas is what I think it influences the American tradition of the press. And in today, we are also in that kind of a model, in that kind of a framework where marketplace of ideas rules all that the press does. But this was not the kind of press that Marxism envisaged. And therefore, I must also say as a kind of tailpiece that the difference, Karl Marx's ideas on the press was certainly liberal thinking. Whereas what came after that, Lenin would be a Soviet-style communism of the 1920s, be different, would be a more close kind of idea of what the press ought to do to further a particular ideology, which was, as I said, the necessity of power at that time. The problem is, it broke out of that. And therefore, this whole that came about, that socialism stroke communism is antithetical to the free press. But that was not what it was meant to be at the fount. At the fount of the ideology, the first principles of the ideology, if you went back, if you brought the doctrine of the free press to the touchstone of Marxism, free press prevailed. That's not unfortunately what happened. There are some important Marxist theoreticians who recognizes, Luxemburg for instance, reverts to the original Marxist idea of socialism when she demands, along with public control, the most unlimited, broadest democracy and public opinion, in her words. Again, an eloquent argument for freedom of expression, freedom to discuss ideas, so that you don't get into the ossified state that socialism, after a point, went through, and went through the travails and the problems that we continue perhaps to face today. So Marx's value for the press was also as a means of political persuasion and the historical concept, as I repeat, of public interest. And therefore, the famous saying that many of you might have heard, he had a holistic concept of public interest to be served by the press. And therefore he says, to quote him again, freedom remains freedom, whether it expresses itself in printer's ink, a parcel of land, consciousness, or in a political meeting. Freedom remains freedom, whether it expresses itself in printer's ink, a parcel of land, right to property, consciousness, or in a political meeting. So that, I was giving this foreword, if you like, or putting the framework of a Marxian view on the press, because it's very important to disabuse ourselves of the idea that the free press is somehow an aberration which has come with capitalism or with liberal ideologies, running amok in our times. And why did this happen? Perhaps, we won't go into the details, but perhaps because there is a distinction, as you know, between what you call the early Marx and the late Marx. There's a kind of epistemological divide somewhere in the, if you want to, 1850s. This side of it was an early Marx and that side of it was the late Marx. And Marx's early, shall we say, concerns were philosophical, were humanistic. The Free Press belonged to that. His later concerns, when he was dealing with, this was a time when he was dealing with the Brumaire. Later, when he was talking about Capital or the One Manifesto, there was a more deterministic, a more economically deterministic Karl Marx. This may be one of the reasons why we have this, why we have this paradox of why the Free Press idea of Karl Marx did not find purchase much beyond the times that we think it should have happened. Let me now go on to look at one or two other aspects of, I won't go into the details of what Karl Marx wrote. I would urge each of you to explore. This is available. This is all in the public domain. The kind of writing in the New York Tribune, the tremendous, prodigious writing on the whole, the vast array of things that he wrote about with great authority, with great finesse, with great analysis, so much so that it was almost encyclopedic writing that we saw from him. Financial journalism, political journalism, diplomatic journalism, and military journalism. These are the four categories really. Military journalism for a good part was written by Engels because he kind of specialized in militarism. Militarism was an important aspect of journalism in those days. The other important aspect, which is also relevant to our times, is Karl Marx as a fact checker. One of the greatest aspects of his work was fact checking. Today, we are living at a time when the president of the most powerful nation in the world gets up chanting fake news, fake news, fake news every morning. And indeed, there is something to what he says, because a lot of news that we see and consume is unreliable. A lot of it is disinformation. A lot of it is planted. A lot of it is put there by vested interests. A lot of it is part of a political agenda or ideological agenda. And therefore the people, the public interest really is compromised in this process. Karl Marx was a great fact checker. One of the things he'd do is look at the dominant Western press and call out the disinformation, call out the lies, call out the spins, call out the travesties of truth, call out the inaccuracies that he found in them. And among his enemies' list was the Times of London, the Post, the Herald, the Economist, the Saturday Review. In fact, he called all of these the fashionable hireling press of London. The fashionable hireling press of London. But then he used the valuable information they purveyed in order to construct his own counters or his own narratives, which was alternative to the kind of agenda or kind of ideas that they sought to propagate. Karl Marx again meant his journalism to be more than academic. He believed in a humane language. He could write very verbose, he could write sentences which had hundreds of words in them. Sentences, a single sentence could have hundreds of words. And then he could in the next sentence, in one short, declamatory short sentence, make a very devastating statement. So he used that style, but he had great admiration for writers like Charles Dickens, whom he saw, in fact he calls them, he praises them as, and I quote him again, the splendid brotherhood of fiction writers in England, whose graphic and eloquent pages have issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists and moralists put together. So the writing of the novelists of the time, he had tremendous regard, tremendous admiration for them, because he thought they spoke truth. Charles Dickens' exposition of poor England, of what happens in the underbelly of England, is perhaps unrivaled by any journalist of the time. And Karl Marx is one of those who recognized that and celebrated that. And therefore, these are the kind of virtues of journalism that we find are missing in us today. I'm not even now going beyond the fact that the left, socialism, communism across the world lost a great opportunity in not center staging, not center planking Marx as the, shall we say, as a great leader of a free press, as a great exemplar of the free press. I'm saying many of these values are what we find are elusive today, what we find are conspicuous by their absence in the free press that we consume today, and therefore our sense of bitterness, our sense of cynicism, our sense of being disillusioned by the media that we have. The current media ecology, many of us seem to think, is more poisonous than beneficial to us. And for good reason, because many of these values, these underpinnings, which were shown by Karl Marx, later in our own independence struggle, you had, I mean, look at anyone who was a leader of the Indian independence movement. He or she would be either a journalist or a lawyer or both. You hardly find an exception. Whether it's Mahatma Gandhi or onwards, any of those leaders. Gandhi, in fact, we know was editing at least 4 or 5 journals at one time. Whether he's traveling on a train or whether he's in his ashram, and he would send these through bearers to be printed. He would send corrections to in the next station to be printed. In fact, he says his weapon of satyagraha, with which he fought the British, was actually evolved through his dialogue with the Indian opinion, which he edited. In his writings in the Indian opinion, there was a kind of a soliloquy, if you like, a dialogue. And he says in that process, in his autobiography, The Truth, he says, the idea of satyagraha evolved, which is a unique weapon to fight the British at that context, in that time. So you find the role of journalism, the catalytic role of journalism, the tremendously, the definitive role of journalism. Here again, in our context, in the fight for independence, in the lead up to independence. But what happened after that is the story that we are living now, where the market paradigm, particularly since 1990s, early 1990s, when we moved into globalization and financial liberalization and so on, and the market paradigm took over. Not all of it is bad, perhaps, but it certainly was bad for the press in this country, and continues to be bad for the press in this country, because the value of public interest was thrown out of the window and substituted by financial profit-making. Not just profit-making, profit maximization. Profit-making is even understandable. In fact, I would argue that it's important for any newspaper or any journalistic entity to be profitable, because unless you're profitable, you cannot perform the dharma of a free press. You cannot speak truth to power, as we so eloquently say. It's only when your financial bottom line is healthy that you can summon up the energy and the guts to speak truth to power. But that's one thing, and it's quite another thing to say profit maximization is our sole aim and our sole ambition, and that's what we will pursue day in and day out. That is what we see has become the problem in the press, and therefore the values of a free press that Karl Marx enshrined, that Karl Marx represented, have collapsed thoroughly in our own time. Let us look at some of the paradoxes of the press that we live with today, and see how close or how far they are to this whole litmus test of whether a public interest is served, whether it is serving public interest. By the way, public interest doesn't mean what interests the public. I think there's a common confusion in our minds. It's a commonplace confusion that public interest is what the public is interested in. Public interest is what the public ought to be interested in, and what will have a transformative value for the public. What will enhance the quality of the public sphere, the Habermas concept of the public sphere. That is public interest. What interests the public is probably the page 4 kind of journalism we get today. The voyeurism that passes off as journalism that we get today. The keyhole journalism that we get today. The sensationalism, the tabloidization, the dumbing down that we get in the name of journalism today. That is what interests the public. That is not necessarily the public interest. And therefore the two are quite different. Giving the public what they want is a dope peddler's argument. Even the man who peddles dope is giving the people what they want. That's not journalism. That is a kind of mockery of journalism. That's an insult to journalism. But let's look at what is the role of the media as the fourth pillar in our democracy today. The Italian philosopher Umberto Eco brought it out as a kind of conundrum, if you like. He said in a democracy, as we all know, under the separation of powers, you have the executive, you have the judiciary, you have the legislature. These are the three pillars of democracy, and the fourth pillar of democracy is the press, the free press. I'm talking about real democracies. We do have democracies where you don't have a free press. And one can argue that no democracy is one unless there is a free press. Just by having elections, you don't have a democracy. Even Hitler was elected to power. So elections don't mean a democracy. What characterizes a democracy? If you say democracy in one breath, you must be able to say a free press in the next breath. Only then it is a democracy. And look around us, we have democracies. We have seen it in our own region. There are so many democracies where there is no free press, and therefore they are qualified democracies. They are truncated democracies. They are kind of apologies for democracies. Whether it's some of our South Asian neighbors, or take a, sometimes you think that if a nation has done economically wonderfully and there is election to the government, that's enough to qualify it as a democracy. Singapore is a good example. You don't have freedom of the press in Singapore because you can't talk about the political situation there in the newspapers in Singapore. The financial press may be free there. You can talk about what's happening in the market, but you can't talk about you cannot have a political discourse in the newspapers there. And therefore, it's not really it's a qualified democracy. And we have democracies of that nature, what are called guided democracy, military democracy. Pakistan, for instance, you keep having that kind of democracy, which is a democracy which is at the will and mercy of the army. So, we are talking about the fourth pillar of democracy in Umberto Eco's scheme of things as a true pillar. So, Eco goes on to say that while the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary are accountable to the people, institutionally or constitutionally, which is so, the executive is accountable to the people through the legislature. The legislature is accountable to the people because every 5 years you have to go back and be voted back or go out of parliament or the state legislature or the assembly. Even the judiciary is accountable to the people at one remove, because as we know, at least notionally, although we've never done it yet, you can impeach a judge with 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament. We came close to doing it recently, I think, with unfortunately a judge of the Calcutta High Court. Impeachment proceedings were initiated in Parliament, in the Rajya Sabha, but they didn't pursue with it because you would be dragging the fair name of the judiciary into the mud. And wisely, the legislators therefore let it be. But the point is, notionally, even the judiciary is accountable to the people, institutionally or constitutionally. So Eco says, while the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary are accountable to the people, institutionally or constitutionally, it is only the fourth pillar of democracy which is not so accountable. And he adds in the next breath, and indeed that is the way it should be, because if the fourth pillar of democracy, is to be made institutionally or constitutionally accountable, one of the other pillars has to supervise, to implement that authority. And therefore, it is no longer a free press. If you are controlled by the executive, you are not a free press. If you are accountable, if you are controlled by the legislature, you are not a free press. If you are controlled by the judiciary, you are not a free press. So that is the paradox of the press, and that is the fineness, of the freedom of the press in a democracy. It's part of the scheme of separation of powers. It's part of the scheme of checks and balances as a result of the separation of powers. And I would argue that the fourth pillar of democracy performs a role of checks and balances as much as the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, but without this threat of being controlled by any of them. And therefore it is that the argument for an external regulation of the press is ipso facto fallacious, because any regulation of the press by an external authority would not then be a free press. You would then not have a free press. You'd have a kept press, you'd have a controlled press, you'd have a censored press, you'd have a regulated press of whatever degree or caliber that you want to speak about. And we know that it is because of the uncontainable virtues of the press that when you want to deal with the press, you have to declare an emergency, like Indira Gandhi did in the 1970s, in 1975. And today it's interesting, when that emergency took place, among those who were at the vanguard of opposing that emergency were, of course, there was the JP movement, and riding tandem with the JP movement were some illustrious parties, or the beginnings of some parties, who are today, some of whom are today in power. They are of the center. And one of the claims, tall claims if you like, of the BJP, which is in power today, is that we are the ones who fought for the emergency, against the emergency of Indira Gandhi. Partly true, some of them were there, some of the personalities were there. The Swarajis, some of them were there. But the problem is that today we are facing the same kind of situation as in the 1970s. The only difference, as has been often pointed out, is that it's not declared. What we have before us is an undeclared emergency. And therefore, the champions of those who fought against the emergency are now the authors, the perpetrators, if you like, of a form of undeclared emergency. I heard the finance minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, say just the other day that we cannot impose an emergency now in India, even if we want to, or even if some government wants to, a government cannot impose emergency, because the nature of media has changed. Because of social media and so on, you cannot control the media. I don't know whether it was a statement of fact or a statement of regret. So this is really true, that it may not be as easy to have a foolproof, closed emergency imposed in India when you have social media, but then you can suspend social media, you can clamp down on all forms of communication. It's not impossible, but it's that much more difficult, and will make you look that much more foolish and ridiculous in the rest of the world. So this is the nature of the problem of, so in India, we have, as I said, the difference between the US is very, very, very important. But we're also living in a peculiar time today, because even this inferred right of freedom of expression, guaranteed under the Fundamental Rights chapter of our Constitution, is under threat, because the entire Constitution is under threat. We have a party, sections of which have been saying openly that we have come to power to throw away this Constitution, to dismantle this Constitution, because we don't believe in this Constitution. So that is the beginning of a crisis of faith in democracy. That is the beginning of a crisis of faith in our republic. That's the beginning of a crisis of faith in the role of the Constitution as the linchpin of our faith in a free democratic dispensation. And you find symptoms of that emerging. You have a peculiar situation today, which which was always there in the Constitution. This contradiction perhaps is always there, but it strikes you, it's in your face when you see the results of it unleashed around you. Article 19, as I said, allows you the freedom of speech and expression. Another article in the Fundamental Rights chapter, Article 21, guarantees you the right to life and personal liberty. Right to life and personal liberty, Article 21. We have a situation where if you exercise your right of freedom of right, speech and expression under Article 19, you forfeit your right to life under Article 21. As Gauri Lankesh, Kalburgi, Pansare, Dabholkar, Shantanu Bhaumik and others realized too late. They were dead by the time they realized that. So this is the way one clause under the Fundamental Rights chapter, which is the most sacrosanct chapter in the Constitution, undoes or nullifies another clause in the Fundamental Rights chapter. Then, are these rights worth the paper they are written on? Is it happening? Is it happenstance that it is happening? Isn't it happening because of a particular situation, a particular climate of disdain for the Constitution, for the values of the Constitution, of disdain for the law, of instigating mob rule, of creating a lynch mentality, instead of going through the process? So these are, I think, the big questions that face us in the media today. And as this was not enough, what we have is and I'm ashamed to say it as a media practitioner myself, a surrender and a kind of terrible surrender of a good section of the media to those in power. The television was the first, I think, that one needs to look at. They have laid themselves supine before the government of the day. Before the government would say ha or pa, they have performed what's called Shashtangam Namaskaram, in Tamil or something. So, of course, the government is using illegally, unfairly, the tools at its command, whether it's Enforcement Directorate or the income tax or inquiries by investigating agencies, fishing expeditions. Not because anything will come out of this, because, as Rajiv Dhawan, one of our jurists, said, in India, the process is the punishment. Somebody initiates a case against you or sends you to a court or lodges a case, you know that there's nothing in the case, nothing comes out of it. But it's several years before nothing comes out of it, before you know that there's no case. The process is the punishment. You have to go to a court of law, you'll be running pillar to post. So in these ways, the independent media cannot be independent. But even before that, the independent media seems to surrender itself. I remember that during the emergency in the 1970s, in college in those days, we used to call, in fact, we used to mock and we used to parody someone of Mr. Goenka of the Indian Express, the founder and chairperson of the Indian Express newspaper, youth press, and so on. But today, when you look back, during the emergency, it was a youth press which had the courage, which had the backbone to oppose Mrs. Gandhi's emergency. You don't even have a press of that nature today. With far greater financial clout, of course, she tried her every book, rule in the, she tried all that she could bring against him, cut off electricity to his plant, threatened him directly, indirectly, in ever so many ways. And yet I think the man stood firm. I'm almost feeling guilty that we were lambasting him, we were kind of, making fun of him as the Jute press. Because what we have today is not even anywhere near as good or as courageous as a Jute press. And we have a digital press, we have a capitalist press, we have a press of digital capitalism. Digital capitalism is the most acute form of capitalism one can think of. Because it's not like monopoly capitalism, it's not like capitalism which preceded it. It's a very acute capitalism where one entity like Google has its tentacles spread over the entire world, straddling the entire world, and probably peeking into much of what each one of us is doing even now, or listening into what we are saying now. So you have a situation where there's a total collapse of the independent mindedness of the freedom of the press, really speaking, where the press is batting for a proto-fascistic agenda which the government is propagating, is implementing on a, in a role, in a kind of insidious manner, in degrees, slow but poisonous degrees. And there's again you see the sharp contrast between the United States and India. When President Trump was standing for presidency of the United States, in the run-up to the presidency, about 2,000 media organizations in the United States, print, television, online, were editorially positioning themselves against Trump becoming the president. They were writing open editorials against this man. They said this man becomes power, will be dangerous, etc. As against the 2,000 against Trump, about 200 alone, 1%, were with Trump, including Fox News and of that ilk, who were supporting the president and saying he is the call of the hour, he is the need of the hour, he is our man on the spot, of the time. But the important thing is, the important difference is, after he becomes president, none of these 2,000 organizations have changed their viewpoint. In fact, I looked at the series, none of them. They all continue to be critical of the President of the United States. At that time, he was only a president potential, he was only a candidate. And the 200 which are with him continue to be with him, fiercely with him. Which is why the President of the United States has to make press bashing part of his daily diet, part of his daily agenda. There's an inimical press out there. But it's to the credit of the press that they do not change, they do not curry favor, they do not change colors just because a man became president. In stark contrast, what we have here is an entire kind of collapse of much of the dominant media, particularly television media, when Mr. Modi became the Prime Minister. Before that, they were critical of him. They were already very sanctimonious critical of him. They would say very, very nasty things about him. And now they are not just singing praises, they are in fact very intolerant of anyone who criticizes them. If you look at time television newscasts, that our show that they say, I sometimes wonder why the BJP needs a spokesperson in the studio at all. Waste of his time, because Ankur is performing that role far better than anybody else. The man can rest at home, he's just brought there and sit. He has nothing, he finds it difficult to compete with the anchor in terms of his loyalty or, talking about the party program. And of course, we know how this whole process of othering is happening on a daily basis in the media, particularly on television media. A lot of the print media is also party to this, is also colluding, is also, I think, responsible for this. Othering a community, othering a caste, particularly a community, othering the Muslims, to put it blatantly, to make it appear that they are not part of this country. If you say anything against the BJP agenda in a television program, you are first asked to shut up. And you are seeing it day in and day out, yet there is no resistance. There is a resistance in our minds. We abhor this. We don't, now I see most houses, they say, oh, don't watch the channel, switch, because you don't know what you're going to see there. You're going to see such silly act there. But we don't have any organized forms of resistance because that is the nature of the fascist methodology. To keep society and politics in a state of flux, in a state of confusion. It was famously said of Hitler, one of his biographers, in normalcy, nothing. In chaos, a title. In normalcy, it is nothing. In chaos is a title. You need chaos in order to create titles. You need chaos to be in power. You create chaos in a country like India, in a pluralistic country like India, by converting pluralism into polarization. The place is plural, make it polarized. And that is, I think, the agenda, and that is what the media, that can be the agenda of a party, because that's the extreme rightist agenda of a party. But the media tailing this is what is the biggest shame, I think, for the freedom of the press, as we understand the basic dharma, the sine qua non of a free media. And that is what we are seeing here. On the other hand, and therefore the media have kind of lost their credibility. And you can see that the media have lost their credibility even from the point of view of the rulers. One would think need the media, because they can threaten the media reflecting their point. They don't have to cultivate the media anymore. I don't think anybody cultivates the media anymore. They tell the media. They tell the media, do this or else. That is what even Trump is trying to do, such a liberal or such a free media ecology like the United States. What Erdogan is doing in Turkey. That is what Sisi has done in Egypt. That is what I believe is happening in India as well. Therefore, the process of othering, there's a shift in terms of languages also. Media is also responsible for mainstreaming the language of our time. I don't know if you have paid attention to this. It's very important, because the limits of understanding, as Wittgenstein famously said, are the limits of our language, actually. Language is very important. And when the vocabulary changes, you know you're changing into a different kind of civilizational space, into a different kind of ecology, in terms of what can be said, what can't be said, what is good, what is bad, in terms of values, in terms of valorizations. The media is leading this process whereby they're defining now we call liberal at one time would be a common. Now called a liberal in India is a liberal. He's a liberal would be a liberal chap. Liberal has become a dirty word. Subsidy has become a dirty word. I heard an important anchor whom I used to respect, so I don't name him, say on the other day on television to a participant who was saying that the government should bring in more subsidies. Are you actually arguing for subsidies in this age? Did I hear you say subsidies? So I thought he had some pornographic language or something. Subsidies is seen as a terrible word. Secular is a terrible word. Secular is distorted as secular, all kinds of puns on it, depending on where it comes from. Socialist is, of course, an anathema, stigmatized word. And nationalism is a new word. Nationalism is an important rediscovery of a word back in currency. Nationalism against patriotism. Of course, it's important to be patriotic, and nobody needs to teach any Indian citizen to be patriotic. It's an insult to India after 60 or 70 years to be told how you should be nationalistic. That you shall stand in such and such a manner, you shall sing in such and such a manner, you shall eat this, you shall dress this way, you shall not eat this, you shall not dress this way. It is an insult. The memory of those who fought for our independence. It's an insult to the entire process of democracy. And yet, the insults that we beat on us daily, and we are asked to lump it or live with it. So this, I think, is the danger to media ecology being an epidemic, a dangerous, not so new, we had hoped not be so suddenly on us, political ideology that we are faced with today. And the challenge of our times is really being men to reimagine the media, to look at retrieving the public interest in the media, to get our backbones straight, to say thus far no further. If the media argues that they are indeed a product of the market, we as consumers of media tell the media, if you are purely products of the market, then at least give us the rights of consumers. If I bought a product in the market, if I bought soap in the market, and washing my clothes, it scratched my skin, I can at least go to a consumer's court. I have not heard of anyone going to a consumer's court to say, I and my family and my children have been reading this newspaper or watching this channel for the last several years, and our minds have all been lobotomized. We become idiots. So I'm demanding $2 million damages. It should. In fact, it would be a good public interest case in a court of law. So, if the media says we are only a product of the market and we have no larger aspirations, no larger role, no larger public interest role, then I think we should at least have the rights of the consumer. Consumer rights. That's not what the media is all about. The media has to keep public interest back in focus. And if the media doesn't, we as the consumers, as the readers, as the viewers of such media can very easily force the media to do that. But we don't, because we think it's not our place to do that. But the problem is an important agency of democracy, an important democracy is being initiated, is becoming a cat's paw in the hands of a dangerous, divisive, polarizing ideology. And so I will end this discussion in memory of Comrade Anil Biswas. I think nothing can be more fitting than to recall the words of a son of Bengal who was our first laureate, Rabindranath Tagore, when he wrote that poem, almost 25 years before independence, before 1947, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world is not broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action. To that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Thank you.
On behalf of for attending. আপনাকে ধন্যবাদ এবং আপনারা সবাই উপস্থিত ছিলেন প্রত্যেককে
ধন্যবাদ করবেন আর দরকার নেই। হ্যাঁ ওটা একটা গুছিয়ে নিন। লাগবে